delighted that we have several elected and other government officials with us today. I don't know if all of them have joined, but I just wanted to take a moment to recognize some of them. And pardon me if I mangle any of your names, but our county executive, George Latimer, who I understand is going to be joining us a little late, Ken Jenkins, who's the deputy county executive. We'll also have with us Crystal Collins from the county, who's the director of faith-based initiatives, Michael Orth, who's the commissioner of community mental health, Robbie Schlaff, who's the director of the Office for Women, and Teja Sanchala, who's the human rights commissioner. We also expect to have from our board of legislators, our chair, Ben Boykin, and several other members, including Mary Jane Shimsky, Nancy Barr, Ruth Walter, and Tyree Woodson Samuels. I also expect to see Noam Bramson, the mayor of New Rochelle, Nancy Kabulian, the mayor of Ardsley, Shanae Williams, a Yonkers councilwoman, Gina Jackson, my own councilwoman in Greenburgh, and Garrett Duquesne, also commissioner from the town of Greenburgh, Delia Fargy-Harson from Mount Vernon, a councilwoman, Joan, and I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce her name, but Ganjranaw Thomas from the village of Portchester, a trustee, and my own WWA member, Iris LaCode, who's representing New York State Assemblyman Chris Burdick. And I hope I haven't missed anybody, but if I have, welcome, glad you're here to join us. So we've got a pretty packed agenda, but before we start our presentations, I'd just like to set the stage by just talking a little bit about my beloved county, Westchester. I've actually lived here longer than I've lived anywhere else, including my idyllic Barbados. So it's really something special for me to be here this long. It's a great county, wonderful place to raise kids, but like many other counties around the country, not everything is equal. And recent studies have shown that there are many disparities affecting the population, particularly people of color, whether it's in terms of high school graduation rates, school suspensions, involvement in the juvenile justice system, in terms of the reaction to chronic diseases and early deaths from things like cancer. And these disparities were made even more starkly obvious during the recent pandemic. So we have our work cut out for us. And today we'll hear from representatives who can speak about their work with GARE, which is an organization that provides tools and guidance and counsel and lots of networking opportunities to help address some of these issues. So we're first going to hear from Julie Nelson, and Julie is Senior Vice President of Programs for Race Forward and the founding director of GARE. And Julie's not going to be on camera with us today because life happens. She's actually taking care of her mom who has COVID, and she's in an area where the internet reception isn't quite stable, but you'll be seeing her presentation. So Julie, if you can hear me, please take it away. And I would encourage everyone, please mute yourselves and put your video on speaker view so you can see our speakers, and put your questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the presentations. So thank you. And Julie, go ahead.
Thank you, Colleen. First, I want to thank the Anti-Racist Alliance, and it's so wonderful to have the prestigious group of people that you named, the number of elected officials and commissioners joining the Anti-Racist Alliance, and really appreciate the opportunity to share some information about the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. This is a critical time for our country. Thinking about a year ago when the pandemic was first hitting, the racial disproportionalities that we've seen in COVID, the economic crisis that has resulted, the murder of George Floyd and uprisings, and then fundamental attacks on democracy. That this is such a critical time for us as a country and how we move forward, who and what we are as a country. So the Government Alliance on Race and Equity is a national network of government working to achieve racial equity and advance opportunities for all. We've been around for about 6 years, a little over 6 years. We're a membership network, have over 300 members working in over 32 states, and we provide tools to put theory into action. So I'm gonna today just have a short period of time, but give you a little bit of an overview of what that's like. So the next slide shows a map of where we're currently located. And we'll share that this map is kind of hard to keep up to date because of the rapid increase in the number of cities, counties, states, and other public sector organizations like housing authorities and port authorities. We are working across the country, both from a membership perspective, and then a next slide shows our staffing for the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, who our team is. And want to do a special introduction to Lenore Wyant, who's also on this call. Lenore is the newest member of the GARE team, and she's our East Regional Manager. I'll provide her email and contact information at the end of my presentation. So the roles and opportunities for government are critical. We need to be able to recognize the difference between our values and our realities, what our aspirations are. And so on the next slide, we can think about the reality that we've got statements that were made that in some ways are foundational to our country, things like the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Jefferson writing, "All men are created equal." Well, we know that what Thomas Jefferson wrote that it was one idea of equality. Jefferson was talking about equality for white men who owned property. And certainly over the course of centuries, our ideas have changed. We're obviously talking about something different today. We're also deeply socialized around ideas of equality and justice. And so on a daily basis, we've got millions of school children reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, saying the words "with liberty and justice for all." But I know even as a school child, that statement "with liberty and justice for all," I could look around my own community and see that we had not yet achieved justice. Finally, thinking about our aspirations versus our realities, Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, writing about government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I would submit to you that that is largely aspirational as well, that we've got work to do. And when we look at the history of race in the United States, we have got to be able to acknowledge that racial inequities, they're not random, they're not natural. We have racial inequities because they were intentionally created over the vast majority of our country's history. And government played a primary role in making that happen. So laws around who could be a citizen, who could vote, who could live where, whose land was whose, all of those were laws that intentionally created racial inequities. Now, anytime that we've had racial inequities, we have had people fighting for equity, fighting for justice. And so with the civil rights movement, it wasn't that one day government woke up and said, "My bad." We had change take place because of the reality that we had community demanding something different. We had a Civil Rights Act, a Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. We had many important milestones that made discrimination illegal. But the harsh reality is that we have continued to have race-neutral policies and practices that continue to perpetuate inequities. So the challenge before us today is actually to think about how we can acknowledge those values and develop proactive policies, practices, and procedures that name and advance racial equity. Now, I want to be clear that Race Forward and the Government Alliance on Race and Equity leads with the topic of race. And at the same time, there's other areas of marginalization. And so on the next slide, I'll share that there's a set of reasons why we do this. That we know that racial inequities are deep and pervasive. That when we look at every single indicator for success, your race predicts how well you do. And in many cases, those indicators are not getting better, and some of them have gotten worse. So the depth and pervasiveness. We also know that there can be discomfort in talking about race. Race can be an elephant in the room. And if we can't talk about something, we're not going to be able to develop solutions. Thirdly, learning an institutional and structural approach to institutional racism can also be used for other areas of marginalization. We know that sexism, heterosexism, ageism, that we've got lots of areas of marginalization, and that for us, learning that institutional and structural approach and thinking about it from a perspective of racism allows us to develop the muscle to do that with other areas of marginalization. Last but not least, specificity matters. We have to be able to use the tools, the skills, the analysis, and apply them specifically to the challenges that we're facing. And so on the next, if you forward, want to name that what we are is race explicit, but not exclusive. We always focus on an intersectional analysis. Looking at the experience of racism and sexism together, we know that what white women experience is different than what women of color experience. So using that intersectional analysis allows us to lead with race, but to look at other areas of marginalization at the same time. So our national practice uses three main buckets. What we have found is that we have to be able to normalize conversations about race.
Okay.
If we don't have a shared analysis, if we don't have commonly held definitions, we might come into this room together and I might be using terminology like structural racism. And some of you might be thinking, well, we just need to stop sort of individual acts of bigotry. We need to stop individual acts of discrimination. Now, both are important. For Race Forward, we focus on institutional and structural racism. What we find is that we have to have those shared definitions in order for us to develop solutions. So then we have to also think about organizing. That means building the internal infrastructure for GARE within local government. And we have to do that in partnership with community. That using an inside-outside approach to organizing so that we're creating change inside institutions while we're also developing, strengthening relationships across sectors and with community. We also have to operationalize racial equity, that it's not enough just to state it as a value or to have a mission statement. We have to be able to use those tools within routine operations. So analyzing the benefits and the burdens, who's impacted by decisions, using data to inform those decisions. These three buckets, normalize, operationalize, and organize, united around a vision, is what we see GARE jurisdictions across the country working on. Now, I want to touch on just a few definitions when it comes to normalizing. Moving to the next slide, normalizing is where we oftentimes start. The definitions that I want to highlight for you, number one, racial inequity. We know, and I said this just a second ago, that every single indicator for success, from infant mortality to life expectancy, and every indicator between birth and death, race predicts how well you'll do. So that's our definition of racial inequity, and it's oftentimes where people start. That definition is on the next slide. And as we're talking about racial inequity, we also need to be super clear that that's sort of what exists right now. When we're working for racial equity, on the next slide, you'll see that we're talking about closing the gaps, eliminating those disproportionalities so that race doesn't predict one's success while lifting up outcomes for all. We don't want to make things equally bad for everyone. We want to improve outcomes. And we know that to do that, we've got to target our strategies to focus improvements for those who are experiencing the worst outcomes right now. Now, I didn't say this in my introduction, but I spent the bulk of my career working in local government. I was with the city of Seattle for 23 years. The two positions that I held for the longest periods of time, I was the director of the Office for Civil Rights, and I was the deputy director of the Human Services Department. And I use that in reference to this definition of racial equity, because one of the patterns that we see in government is oftentimes what government wants to do is to think about services and big advocate for services. And at the same time, we know that if we're just providing services, it can be a bit of a Band-Aid. We have to actually move beyond thinking about services and focus on changing policies, institutions, and structures. Thanks for that time check. Couple of other definitions: the differences between diversity, equity, and inclusion. We know that diversity is important, but we can change the numbers of people of color who are represented in government and still have the same system. So diversity is an important step, a milestone towards equity, as is inclusion, but it's not the same thing as justice. And so on the next slide, looking at the range of diversity, inclusion, and equity, what we're really trying to do is move towards justice so that we've got policies, practices, and procedures that ensure equitable outcomes. We focus on outcomes, on the actual outcomes, as opposed to just intentions. Final definition that I want to give, set of definitions that I want to give you on the next slide is thinking about racism and the reality that oftentimes we'll use a word like racism and not delve into the nuances between different levels of racism. So for us, we think about individual racism as bigotry or discrimination by an individual based on race. We also know that we've got institutional racism within organizations, policies, practices, and procedures that work better for white people than for people of color, even without naming that. It doesn't have to be intentional. It is the way that systems have historically been designed. So again, we focus on the outcomes. Structural racism means that we've got a history and current reality of institutional racism across all institutions, and those combine to create systems that negatively impact communities of color. So working within local government, we always want to focus on institutional racism first and recognize that structural racism, the larger context, is where we ultimately need to expand our work towards. So with operationalizing means that we're asking a different set of questions. And so moving from asking a question on the next slide, a question like, who's a racist, to thinking about what's causing racial inequities. Instead of asking the question around what did they mean or what was their attitude, we're looking at actions and we're looking at impacts. We're no longer exclusively thinking about prejudice, what beliefs made someone to do something, but also thinking about what are the institutions that are responsible. And rather than thinking just about grievances, how can we fix an isolated incident, something that just happened, that we're looking for those proactive strategies and solutions. So you'll have this PowerPoint to look at the racial equity tool that we provide as a resource to GARE members. We're on a routine basis. We're using a racial equity tool, both from a process and product perspective, actively inserting racial equity into decision-making processes. I think the next slide has a picture of the cover of the racial equity tool and a link to it. Want to close out by just thinking about the Government Alliance on Race and Equity and what it is that can be a benefit for all of you. That thinking about elected and appointed officials along with staff who are interested in advancing racial equity. GARE is a resource for those elected and appointed officials. We've also got opportunities to partner on specific policy or programmatic changes and introducing local government, cities and counties to GARE and encourage you all to join. Those of you that are in government, those of you that work with government. The last slide is around what the membership benefits of GARE are. I can hold on this. If there's additional questions, I'd be happy to respond to them. There's also a couple of links there, and I think Lenore is going to put the links in the chat. And so with that, I will turn it back to you, Colleen.
Okay, thank you very much, Julie. And I guess in the Q&A, we can talk more specifically about what does it take to be a member of GARE. But with us next is Dena Diorio, who's the county manager of Mecklenburg County in North Carolina. And Dena was formerly a Westchester resident, so she's familiar with our county, and she has been using GARE in her county. She'll tell you why she chose GARE, what led her county to seek help, and what she's done and what results have been achieved. So go ahead, Dena. Are you on mute?
Thank you, Colleen. Yep, appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. As Colleen indicated, I am from Westchester County. I was born in New York City, but I grew up and raised in Yorktown Heights, New York. I did my undergraduate work at SUNY Plattsburgh, and my master's degree is from Columbia University. So spent a lot of time working for the city of New York, 2 cities in Connecticut, and have been in Mecklenburg County since 2007. But Mecklenburg County is Charlotte. We are the largest county in the state of North Carolina. And I'm really happy to be here today to, I'm having trouble, there we go. So as Colleen indicated, these are the topics that I'm going to talk about in my presentation today. And the first topic is what prompted our work on equity and inclusion. And I think that this slide really tells the story. We had an officer-involved shooting on September 20th, 2016, resulted in the death of Keith Lamont Scott. This led to days of rioting, multiple injuries. We actually had another death of Justin Carr, who was killed by rioters, significant property damage. And this really brought to the forefront historical issues of racism in employment, housing, education, and economic opportunity. And as a result of that, as county manager, what I said was that we needed to make equity a top priority in our county. And one of the ways that you do that is that you really make you sort of the tone at the top. And so I created an Office of Equity and Inclusion in the county manager's office. We had one individual who was sort of running what we call our diversity council that was in our human resources department, and decided that in order to demonstrate our commitment to equity, that we were going to create this office in the county manager's office. And it really is putting equity at the center of our operations, looking at our policies, our partnerships, and having a long-term commitment to addressing systematic issues related to racism. We have an equity vision statement. We envision that all people in our county will have an equitable opportunity to thrive in the workplace and in the community. And that's really what drives our work every single day. So why GARE? And I think Julie talked a lot about this. They have a really strong framework. We looked at a lot of organizations. We did an RFP and we asked people to come in and give us, what they do and how they approach this work. And these are the things that GARE does that we think make them very special. They have a racial equity framework. They build organizational capacity. This is what's really critically important, is to be able to build organizational capacity so it outlives the people who work there today. the racial equity tools, the focus on data. Data is incredibly important to know how we're doing and whether or not we're making an impact. Partnerships with institutions and communities, and this need to operate with urgency and accountability. And Julie just spent a long time talking about this. She called it the national practice model. We call it the best practice model. And we believe that this is the way that we can be effective in our organization. Now, this is just the cover of our Equity Action Plan annual report. And I'm going to sort of swing on to what has been accomplished. And you can get the full report on our website. It's mecnc.gov. But I'm just going to go through some of the highlights of what we've done. First, we do have an equity action plan, and this is our equity action plan. We've got 6 goals: infrastructure and tools. We are working on workforce equity, inclusive engagement, health equity, economic opportunity, and criminal justice. And under these 6 goals, we have 11 strategies and 61 actions that are going to help us advance these goals. And this is really our North Star. This is the document that we live to every single day. So what have we accomplished? The first one that we've done under the infrastructure and tools area, we have a strategy around advancing racial equity and racial equity training. And so we have done a number of activities as it relates to the strategy, advancing equitable training. We had a racial equity webinar series. We have departmental equity action teams, and we're facilitating dialogues on race. And you can see the results on the right. We've had 2,500 employees already trained. We have about 5,600 employees so far in our county. And so we're almost halfway there and getting everybody trained. 100% of my department directors have an equity and inclusion initiative on their annual work plan. We had 1,500 employees participate in the webinar series. We've held 2 community town halls. We have 24 county departments that have formed equity action teams that are looking at equity within their respective departments. And we've had 20 work groups first participated in these facilitated dialogues. Strategy 2 is workforce equity. This is around increasing employee awareness around their development opportunities across all of our salary plans. So we've done enhancements to our leadership programs. We are using online learning platforms to allow all of our employees to develop their skills. And one of the biggest results we've had is we've increased the number of people of color in pay bands D and E by 1.5%. And the pay bands D and E are our highest pay bands in the county. And having more people of color in these pay bands is really one of the ways that we're trying to advance workforce equity. Inclusive engagement, one of the strategies is to ensure that our Board of County Commissioner meetings are accessible to all of our residents. This is about being able to engage all of our employees in the work, all of our residents in the work of government. And so what we've done is we now broadcast or rebroadcast all of our commission meetings in over 60 languages. We have American Sign Language interpreters at all of our commission meetings now, and we have real-time Spanish language interpreters at all of our commission meetings. And this is just one way that we're trying to expand access and make sure we have inclusive engagement in Mecklenburg County government. Health equity. We have what we call Mecklenburg County Community Resource Centers, and these are centers that provide a multitude of services to our employees. And this is how we bring Mecklenburg County to you, where we actually bring services into the community and allow people to access multiple services at a single location. And around health equity, the employees in that department that work at the CRC wanted to make sure that they were very in tune to issues around implicit bias. So they have all participated in an implicit bias training hosted by Race Matters for Juvenile Justice. And this is a 3-day training program that looks at these issues in depth. And so every single one of those employees have taken that training so that they can meet people where they are in the CRC and to be able to provide them better service around health. Economic opportunity. One of the strategies is to increase minority contracting participation in Mecklenburg County government. This is an area that we have not done well. So what have we done? We've completed a year-long diversity study. We have 11 recommendations that are being implemented that will improve minority contracting opportunities. We've held 3 community engagement events with nonprofit organizations throughout the county, and we've had 66 community engagements held with minority businesses to inform them about programs and services and to increase their access and their ability to compete for county contracts. Criminal justice. This is a big one, I think, for everybody, really working on reducing racial disparities and disproportionality within the criminal justice system. And so we have developed and deployed implicit bias training to all our major criminal justice agencies in Mecklenburg County. So what has been accomplished? I think the data tells the story. And what we're trying to do is create the data and the measures that we need to use to be able to track our success. And I'm not going to go through these in detail, but we are looking at things within the county, but as well as within our county as well. So these are the ones that we're going to use to measure community impact. Again, not wanting to go through these in detail, but wanting to let you know that we are going to track our results on a regular basis to make sure that we're staying aligned to the work that we're trying to accomplish. And these are our organizational metrics. These are the ones that we're going to hold ourselves accountable to on an ongoing basis in Mecklenburg County to make sure that we are in fact advancing racial equity throughout our organization. And then just briefly, how are Westchester and Mecklenburg County similar? Well, we're both counties about a million people. We have cities and towns of various sizes. County operating budgets are very similar at about $2 billion. And we also serve in a very significant way in the area of economic development. Mecklenburg County is the economic engine for the state of North Carolina. There is no doubt about that. So our economy drives what happens in the state. And that's also true for Westchester County. Your proximity to New York City, you have a lot of corporate headquarters, a lot of Fortune 500 and 1,000 corporations there, and you have a big focus on business recruitment and retention. And I think that's critically important. The vision statements that we have: Westchester County will be a destination for all people to live, work, and enjoy all it has to offer. Mecklenburg County will be a community of pride and choice for people to live, learn, work, and recreate. Imperative, we have visions that mandate a strong equity and inclusion program. And we also talk a lot about corporate relocations and how important that is. And I can tell you that companies now believe that equity and inclusion is an economic imperative. And when they start looking at places where they want to relocate or expand, your equity and inclusion work will be a factor in that decision making. So I think it's really important from an economic perspective that we look at equity and inclusion. I think it's also really important for your employees. Your employees want to work for an organization that care about them. And equity and inclusion is incredibly important in that area. When we first did our first assessment of our employees, we did a countywide survey, and we had huge participation. And employees care about this. They want to understand equity and inclusion. They want to be able to talk about it. And they want the tools in their toolbox to be effective in this area. And if you want to be an employer of choice, this is something that you have to be able to do effectively, so employees will not only want to come, but they'll want to stay. And so that ends my presentation, and I will turn it back over to Colleen.
Thank you very much, Jean. I really appreciated all that you shared and the parallels between Mecklenburg and Westchester. Now we'll hear from Anisha Gandhi, who's the Acting Assistant Commissioner and the Director of Racial Equity and Social Justice Initiatives in the Bureau of HIV in New York City in the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And Anisha is going to speak about her agency's undertaking of work with GARE, how it guided them, what processes and objectives they implemented, how they tracked their progress, and what outcomes they've accomplished. So with that, Anisha.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much to Colleen and all of the organizers for letting me be a part of today. I apologize, I don't have a formal presentation, but I'm absolutely happy to speak to some of our experiences working with GARE. So as you may or may not know, the New York City Health Department is one of the largest public health agencies in the country and potentially in the world. We have over 6,000 employees and, and of course are responsible for really, protecting and promoting the health of all New Yorkers. And in this moment are, one of the lead organizations in combating the COVID-19 public health emergency in the city. And given the, how we were one of the primary epicenters of this pandemic in the United States, have really also been in network in terms of providing leadership to the national response and to other jurisdictions as well. But of course, our efforts and our attentions are not just limited to COVID-19, but for a long time have been established across many aspects of health. And we know that, while our mission is to protect and promote the health of all New Yorkers, that we know that not all New Yorkers have the same opportunity to achieve and maintain full health, and that is unjust. And so it is really critical for us to really center equity in the work that we do. And what I will name is that I really credit GARE and Race Forward, which is one of the organizations that supports the GARE initiative, in really guiding on setting up our strategy, which at this point has become an agency-wide movement for us. So, and something that I think other agencies have looked to as being kind of a leader of this systemic organizational change and institutional reform. So in 2016, under Commissioner Mary Bassett, who's now at the Harvard School of Public Health, we've launched Race to Justice, which was this agency-wide initiative to really center racial equity and social justice in all that we do. But again, with this using a targeted and strategic framework that uses those principles that Julie outlined of organizing, operationalizing, and normalizing. And so one of the things that was done under that is that in terms of that normalizing and building that shared analysis, is that we created an agency-wide core workshop, which was a full day in-person, was an in-person workshop, which of course that piece has been suspended during this time for safety reasons, but that really required all staff, all of our 6,000 staff, regardless of where they worked, whether they were out in the community or in one of our main offices, to undergo this training to really understand these concepts and constructs of race, how that's related to health, how racism produces health inequities, and how that, as Julie referenced, operates at multiple levels. So really helping people understand what we mean when we talk about racism, why it's so critical to think about for public health, and how we can start applying that to our work. And that, it was really well received, and was really, I think, because it was so intensive and interactive, gave people a moment to really interrogate their own experiences and think about how racism has showed up in their lives, in their workplace, and ways that they even, regardless of role, had both a responsibility and had an opportunity to help make our institution more of an anti-racist institution. And so it was really incredible to be part of that. I actually was part of the first cohort of people to be a peer facilitator for that. So underwent my own intensive training to prepare for that, and got to engage in those dialogues and some of that kind of thinking, change in thinking and feeling and perspective of so many of my staff members from all over our agency. Toward other pieces of the organizing, we have a really robust infrastructure now, 4.5 years into this movement across our agency. In terms of, it really has, it's become an absolute movement that it's just embedded into the work that we do across levels and across all areas and domains of our work, such that even with changes in administration and leadership, this is something where we've now built it into the institution in a way that really would be difficult to undo. And part of that's been done through focusing the work and creating kind of strategic plans around it, and also creating enough organization in terms of bringing people together around common goals. So at the agency level, we have people who work on communications and community engagement, who have put together an action kit that really help identify kind of common terms, but also strategies for when we're planning new programs, what are some ways to really think about and help plan with the communities that we seek to serve, to get their input on how we can best design things so that we are appropriately allocating our resources, so that we're tailoring things to make them culturally responsive and accessible, so that we're not wasting government dollars and taxpayer dollars, and that we are actually best leveraging them to make sure that our services are things that are going to reach people and help reduce health disparities. We've worked on thinking about and centering equity in our finance and contracting, and that's actually been a big piece of things for our bureau, the Bureau of HIV, which really leads New York City's response to the HIV epidemic, which currently we really think about citywide and statewide as our effort to end the HIV epidemic, and we come closer and closer each year to meeting that goal. So a big way we've thought about that is that BHIV is a little bit unique in the health department in that we receive a large volume of federal dollars from both HRSA and CDC that we, as recipients, because we are also an epicenter of the HIV epidemic, that we then grant out to community-based and clinical organizations who provide on-the-ground HIV services. And what we've realized, we distribute over $100 million in those funds annually. And what we've realized is that we know that, disparities remain, inequities remain, that disproportionately Black and Latinx communities continue to be overburdened by the HIV epidemic. And that is even more pronounced among women. Consistently in New York City, over 90% of new infections, new HIV diagnoses occur among Black and Latino women. And that's unacceptable. And we see that disparity, though not as pronounced among men as well. But we consistently see that even though we do our best to kind of distribute services, that we need to do a better job reaching Black and Latinx folks, and we need to do a better job also supporting organizations that are led by people of color, that have experience and success engaging communities of color so that we deliver more affirming and responsive services, and also so that we support healthcare providers and community-based organizations that are led by people of color to provide those economic opportunities as well, and make sure that they have an equitable opportunity to engage in our contracting and funding opportunities. So we actually use the GARE tool with a lot of support from Julie and her team to really overhaul our process of how we write and distribute and evaluate our requests for proposals, our RFPs and funding opportunities and contract opportunities, to really look at that whole process so that we could be more equitable in the ways that we disperse funding to local organizations. And that has been taken up across our bureau, as well as something we've shared across the agency as a strategy. And the GARE tool is really helpful in not only organizing, what information do we need to better do this? What information can we collect? But also what might be some of the unintended consequences? What do we need to think about and prepare for in the short term as well as long term? And how do we continue to evaluate and improve those processes? And then I will also acknowledge that working more closely, we actually had a concentrated engagement with Julie and one of her colleagues to familiarize more people across our bureau's leadership in the Bureau of HIV, where every single program had to take on a project and apply the GARE tool to improve some of our internal processes. And again, really institutionalize centering equity in all that we do. And a lot of that was, again, focused more on our internal work and making sure that we are maintaining equity in our workforce, because as many people will acknowledge, it's important to not just think about that external piece, but really, kind of clean up our own systems and think about our staff who are, we have a very diverse staff. The health department staff, I think, is composed of mostly people of color and, representation from a lot of different communities. So it's important to, as we continue to serve the community, also make sure that we are serving and respecting our large constituencies within our agency, so that the experience of working at the health department is not determined by your racial, ethnic identity or any other aspect of your identity, and that everyone has that full opportunity to be recruited into these opportunities for stable and secure jobs, to thrive and have opportunities for professional development, to have opportunities for leadership, and continue to make an impact in the communities that we want to serve, because people who are at the health department are also of these communities, and we want to work toward having an agency that continues to be more and more reflective of the richly diverse community in New York that we serve. And then just quickly, some other things that we've worked towards since really prioritizing equity. Certainly a big one is I am the first person who has served as the Director of Racial Equity and Social Justice Initiatives within our Bureau. It was a newly created position, acknowledging that we wanted to really streamline and align this work across our team of over 300 people and make sure that equity was really embedded and prioritized across all that we do. And that has also like helped kind of push along a sea change of making other leaders in other areas of health department work know that this should remain a priority and that there really should be dedicated personnel to attending to these issues and helping to support with expertise and capacity building, support these initiatives moving forward. Another thing we've done is really pushed for more inclusive data reporting and data collection so that we are getting better at having really being inclusive in terms of gender identity, sexual orientation, and race ethnicity across all the ways that we collect data in the community and then how we report that back out. And so I previously, sometimes when we would present our annual report of our surveillance data, which is really a really high profile report and used by a lot of community stakeholders, we wouldn't always have it broken down and including a lot of groups. So I know that we've often gotten input from community members saying, you know, acknowledging that we don't always show data for smaller groups like Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, for multiracial people, for Indigenous people. So I've gotten better at really systematizing that and also being affirming and inclusive in the ways that we report out measures and key indicators for our transgender population, for both trans men and trans women, as well as those who are trans and gender nonconforming. And so, and then I will, I think in closing, acknowledge that that really I'm excited about where this is going. So we have had an opportunity through a new infusion of federal funds to really advance and kind of accelerate our progress toward ending the HIV epidemic. And right now we are in the process of working with our key community advisory bodies to update and formalize our ending the epidemic plan for the next years to come. And I think more than ever before, it is so explicitly centering equity in a variety of ways in terms of it's one of our key kind of priorities that guides the entire document, but also we have a number of strategies that are specifically focusing on leveraging the assets of communities of color to drive solutions and to closing gaps in both practical, upstream, and multi-sectoral partnered ways, so that we are thinking about kind of hitting on this at all levels. Okay, so actually the last thing I will add is that I think in the time of the COVID emergency as well, I think being a member city of GARE has been really useful because you are automatically connected to a nationwide community of practice where through the portal, people are asking questions that I think come up in so many jurisdictions and getting access to how people are solving common problems. And so I know that when the pandemic first hit, I was regularly engaging on the rapid response calls and just getting to hear both presentations and ideas as they were emerging and being formed and getting to work through with people, how do we do this and what are kind of practical ways that we can center equity as we deal with the pandemic that we know is disproportionately impacting communities of color and other marginalized groups. So I absolutely can say that, you know, working in this space and especially with the support of experts from GARE has been transformative for me and for our agency, and I'm excited to see where the rest of this work goes. So looking forward to hearing, you know, what that looks like in Westchester as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Anisha. Really appreciate all that you shared, particularly the emphasis on data, economic opportunities, advancement, et cetera. Now we're going to hear from Sarah Schooner, who is a special policy advisor for equity in the Mayor's Office for Economic Opportunity. And as such, she is in the umbrella organization that oversees the entire contract for GARE throughout New York City. And so Sarah is going to speak about the mayor's mandate that put all this into motion, some of the challenges of implementing GARE in a vast organization like New York City government with multiple agencies and departments at various stages of implementation. And then once you've worked with GARE, then what are the next steps? What can you do beyond that? And so Sarah's going to speak to us about that.
Thank you so much. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep,
Great.
we can.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm going to start by just giving a very brief presentation on Equity NYC, which is the city's interagency racial and social equity program, and then move quickly into lessons learned. Of all of our presenters today, I am by far the rookie of the group, and I'm still very much in the learning stages of doing this institutional anti-racist work through local governments. And so I think what you'll hear from me is the ways that GARE has been a value in starting out this work and in thinking about how to do this at such a large scale. So Equity NYC's mission is really to build local government capacity around racial and social equity by providing all of New York City's agencies with the resources, coordination, accountability, and community that's necessary to be able to create better outcomes that we've heard talked about so much already today, and to do what we can to make all of New York City's 100+ agencies just as good as the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene and everything that you just heard about, which continues to be a North Star in the way that the city does this work. The way that this happened for us in a real, institutionalized way was through the signing of Executive Order 45, which was signed in May of 2019 and requires the Mayor's Office of Operations, which is where I work, to do a number of things that kind of fall into two main buckets, one around data and one around practice. It established that a mandate to continue to collect 45 indicators around racial and social equity, disaggregated by race, ethnicity, gender, income, and sexual orientation where applicable and available, and report those out. In addition to collecting and publicly reporting on 5 new citywide equity metrics, which are collected at agency level. And in addition to that, it mandated that the Mayor's Office for Operations provide guidance to city agencies on how to do better at doing a deep dive on their own policies, practices, and programs, and thinking about how to disrupt and uproot the root causes of structural racism that exist inside city government due to historical inequality and oppression. So what that has looked like is an approach that, as I mentioned, has this dual commitment to both data and practice, where we collect this information that's disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and other demographic variables, identify inequalities that exist that fall inside the jurisdiction of different agencies, use that to assess agency practice. From there, develop and implement strategy that addresses the root causes of these inequalities and disparities, and then develop and collect metrics that really get at an understanding of how agencies and the people that we serve are better off based on the strategies that we've devised, only to then collect more information and do it all over again. What that looks like is a few different things. As I mentioned, it's through the social indicators and equity report, which right now has about 60 different agencies that submit data to it. And there's about 45 different outcomes level metrics that we collect that range from high school graduation rates, voting patterns, who's employed in city services, walk to a park, violence, kind of across a range of policy domains. Obviously a lot of health indicators. And then these 5 new citywide equity metrics, which covers really how the city is doing its business. So who's receiving services, where those services are located, who's receiving city contracts, who's being employed by the city, and what equity practices agencies are engaging in. And then all of that information is also posted on our new digital tool, which will be going live hopefully any day now. So what it looks like is this new digital social indicators and equity report that this is just like the front page that we're trying to make very user-friendly and available to the public so that everybody can take a look year over year on the trends of the racial, social, and environmental equity issues of the city and how the city is going to be addressing them. Here's one of our education pages, as well as a listing of all of the strategies, at least for education, on what we're doing to reduce disparity. And this covers a whole bunch of different topics. In addition to that, on the practice side, we're providing training and technical assistance to agencies on how to do intensive equity assessments and developing equity action plans to address disparity inside their agencies. So far, we've sent one cohort of 11 agencies through a 12-month intensive program through Equity and Results, which is a leading expert in data-driven results-based system change. And what Equity and Results has done is help these agencies conduct an analysis to understand how they may be contributing to inequality, and then identify a set of performance measures and an action plan to uproot those changes. That's a very, very brief overview of what Equity NYC has looked like over the past year. As far as lessons learned, there's a few things. One, there's been an incredible amount of value in having direction from the top through an executive order. It does a few things. One, it helps centralize the data collection and coordination. We're being able to have data sets that talk to each other. We're being able to count things in the same way and have a conversation across agencies in a way that wasn't possible before. I mean, obviously, also there's a huge value in having an executive order and creating accountability and letting all agencies know that racial inequality is something that they need to be thinking about, and not just the Department of Health and the Department of Social Services and the Administration for Children's Services, but also the Department of Buildings and the Mayor's Office for Contracting Services and the Department for Citywide Administrative Services. We all have a piece of this, and we all, together we may be individual agencies, or separately we may be individual agencies, but together we're the system. And it requires the entire system to come together to think about how to create those structural changes. And so that has been really valuable. In addition, with over 100 agencies and depending on how you count, over 350,000 employees in New York City government, there's really no way to do any type of quality control without some type of mandate. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges in doing this at such a scale. We have places like the Department of Health, who we've been looking to as an example, and obviously we use GARE all the time. New York City is a GARE member. The Mayor's Office for Operation pays for a GARE membership, which then extends to our agencies, which has been incredibly helpful, both in terms of using the GARE members portal to see what other cities are going through this past year with COVID, with the national reckoning on racism throughout the country. They're being able to see how other cities were handling this was just invaluable, and being able to connect with counterparts in other cities who were grappling with how to use this moment was something that I don't know how we would have done this work without it. In addition to take on such a huge task, being able to be connected to cities that have done this work before was saved us so much time and effort, because we didn't have to recreate the wheel. We could understand from lessons learned what it meant to create a model that goes deep with agencies that are already doing the work, in addition to being able to go wide across agencies that are just starting fresh, and making sure that we weren't creating unintended consequences or letting people off the hook and saying that they were doing anti-racist work when that wasn't necessarily the case. And so we continue to find GARE to be a hugely valuable resource. In addition, though, we have had to think about ways to tailor our work to different agencies depending on where they're at, which is why we've contracted with other vendors such as Equity and Results to really take us from understanding anti-racist principles to developing plans that can then be implemented over time and creating a culture of accountability that exists across these hundreds of thousands of people. In addition to contracting with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond to do these extensive 3-day undoing racism trainings for agency leadership, which have been hugely formative for gatekeepers and policymakers in the city. In addition to working with more localized community-based organizations that have an understanding of what individual agencies are doing and how they affect the residents of communities. And so being able to have both a top-down and a bottom-up approach has allowed us to create accountability and standardization where it's necessary, but also allowed us to build the relationships and the trust that we needed to do it in a way that takes context into account and reduces our odds of unintended consequences over time. And that's pretty much where I will leave it for now, and happy to take questions along with the rest of the group.
Great, Sarah. Thank you very much for your contribution. The knowledge that this started with a mandate, which made it easier for each department to implement, and how you've taken the work beyond gear into more data analysis and results-based accountability. So that ends our formal presentation, and we have about 20 minutes